Can everyone hear me okay?
Intro. And then can you just turn it off when you're done?
Okay, great. Well, welcome everyone. We're very glad that you've joined us this afternoon for the 5th Ronald S. and Catherine K. Christenson Lectureship in Politics and Law. I am Samuel Piccolo, an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science, and it's my real pleasure to welcome you on behalf of the department and the lecture series. This lectureship has arisen from the vision and generosity of two individuals. Ron Christenson came to Gustavus in 1969 to establish a new department of political science. Professor Christenson nurtured the department and major into one of the college's finest for nearly 30 years before his death in 1998. Ron found his professional passion at the intersection of politics and in law, and although I've only been here for a few months, I can't count the number of times I've heard his name mentioned in reverential terms, even 25 years after his passing. To honor and nurture Ron's legacy at Gustavus, Catherine Kidd Christenson, herself a longtime Gustavus employee who taught courses in English and women's studies at Gustavus and was later a staff associate in development and public affairs, has endowed this lectureship to reflect Ron's dual specialties in teaching and scholarship: political theory and the history of political thought on the one hand, and constitutional law and jurisprudence on the other. This lecture series, held every other year, is a fitting tribute to Ron's legacy and intellectual passions, and it exists because of Catherine's vision and generosity. Catherine is sitting down front today, so I ask that please everyone join me in recognizing and thanking Catherine Christenson for her generous gifts that have made tonight and future lectures possible. The subject of today's lecture is both timely and locationally appropriate. It's timely because the last decade, in my opinion anyway, we'll see what the professor thinks, has been perhaps the most interesting time for federal Indian law and Native American politics for 40 years or so. And it's locationally appropriate because here in St. Peter, we are right next to the spot where, in 1851, the U.S. government signed a treaty at Traverse des Sioux. The U.S. efforts to change the Sioux way of life after the treaty, as well as insufficient payments for the ceded land, directly led to the U.S.-Dakota War just over a decade later. In that war, fought not far from here, over 450 Americans and 150 Sioux died in the fighting, followed by the execution of 40 Dakota in the war's aftermath. That aftermath also saw the forced removal of the Sioux from southern Minnesota. Over 150 years later, events such as the annual Mankato Powwow have proven that Native peoples in the area, as across the country, have not disappeared, and as we'll hear tonight, this afternoon, serious moral, political, and legal questions about land and sovereignty remain. There is, quite simply, no one better to speak on this subject to us than Professor Kevin Washburn. Citizen of the Chickasaw Nation, Dean of the University of Iowa Law School, former faculty at several others, including the University of Minnesota, Professor Washburn has published countless articles, chapters, and volumes on federal Indian law. He has worked in the judiciary, as general counsel of the National Indian Gaming Commission, as prosecutor for the Department of Justice, and served in the Department of the Interior in the Obama administration. I also met Professor Washburn at an event last year, and we shared a shuttle to the airport at 4:30 in the morning, and I can safely say that in addition to his professional accomplishments, he is the friendliest and kindest person at that hour that I've ever met. And we are lucky to have him here. Please join me in welcoming Professor Washburn.
Thank you, Sam. We hadn't had our coffee yet, and he was delightful as well, I will say. It's really a big honor to be here to present the Christenson Lecture. This is a very prestigious thing, and I actually, Gusties are all over the place. I know there's a lot of Gusties here in St. Peter, but they're all over the place. And the first Gustie that I ever met was in my law school class 30 years ago or so. Lori Lynn Phillips, she's a lawyer now in Seattle, and after the announcement went out, she sent me a really nice message. You're going to be at Gustavus. You've made it. And I was like, indeed. So I've been hearing about Gustavus for. Yeah. Okay, let's see. I'm going to do this. I'm going to turn. Let me turn it on. Okay. How about now? Is that better? Better. Okay. All right. Well, it's really a big honor to be here. I'm so grateful for Professor Piccolo and Professor Knudsen for having me. I got to sit in the poli-sci department today, and we see this on TV, right? We romanticize what it's like being in a department at a liberal arts college, and I think the rest of us, everybody that goes into academia thinks that's what their life is going to be like, with small offices and students coming in, and it's just really not like that. I'm in a big public university, and it feels more like a bureaucracy than a liberal arts college, and it was just delightful to be there today. I know it's probably got its problems, but I've romanticized it, and it lives up to that. It seems really wonderful. All right, well, let me get to my talk. The talk is more of a research agenda than a paper with a single profound thesis, but I do have some claims and things that I want to talk about with you today. And the subject is Landback, and probably 5 years ago, maybe nobody had heard of Landback very much, but really, we've really started talking about it a lot. And it's the idea of returning land to tribal nations. And it's really beginning to get great momentum. And I wanted to talk a little bit about that. This is the symbol for an organization that does Landback called the Indian Collective. And the Indian Collective, part of the reason this is happening so much is there's so much more support of it than there ever was. The Indian Collective has received more than $175 million in grants to do work partially for Landback and to help spur Landback around the country. One longstanding demand of theirs is to return the land in the Black Hills to the Great Sioux Nation. And there's a pretty strong moral claim that they can make about that. And they've been leading protests and advocacy on that for a long time. Interestingly, in 1980, after a couple of decades of litigation, the Great Sioux Nation won a judgment against the United States for $100 million. I think it was the largest judgment ever confirmed by the U.S. Supreme Court at the time it came out in 1980. And after litigating for 20 or 25 years to get that judgment, they wouldn't take the money. And they still haven't taken the money. And it's well over $1 billion now with interest. And they've said, we don't want the money. We want land. We want our land back. And the law does not allow for that. And so the money has sat in the Treasury. They have refused to take it. And by the way, the kind of the irony or the evidence of the commitment, these are some of the poorest people in the United States that are refusing to take what is more than $1 billion now because they don't want the money. They want the land back. And so the commitment is powerful. Another claim was by Professor David Troyer in The Atlantic in 2021. He said all the national parks should be transferred over to tribes, should be returned to tribes. And his argument was a good one. It was that they are the most iconic lands in the United States. Why don't we return the national parks to tribes? That was quite a bold and provocative statement because I think the national parks are probably the lands that people love the most in the United States too, so it was quite provocative. He is Professor Troyer is a member of the Leech Lake Band of Ojibwe, and he's actually a well-published author. He's written several works, and he's also an MMA fighter, mixed martial arts fighter. He's a provocative guy, but this one got a lot of attention too, and really started kind of tongues wagging about Landback, and so kind of a neat claim, interesting claim. I want to talk a little bit about language. And this is kind of the elephant in the room for me in some ways. I'm going to use the word Indian. And that's not because I like the word Indian. It's a stupid name for what I am and what many of us are. But I'm a lawyer, and there are 5 volumes of the United States Code that say Indians on the spine. It's what the law calls us. And there's a few statutes that have Native American in the title, but most of them actually have Indian in the title. And so I don't think it's the right name. It's been the wrong name for more than 500 years, but it stuck somehow. Columbus made a wrong turn somewhere, and we're stuck with this term.
And so forgive me. I'm just going to ask for your forgiveness that I'm using this term, but it's what in my world, law is very conservative, and it's what's in the law. So you will hear me say it. So let's talk a little bit about why do we do land back. Like much of our political discourse, the reasons for it are, well, they're multivariate, and there's a lot of different reasons, but they're complicated. One of them is, social justice, but even that has to be unpacked a little bit. One thought is that they are in part reparations. Return of land is reparations. I have to say, it's not a remedy for some of the things that have happened. It's not nearly adequate for a lot of the things that have happened. When you think about the massacre at Wounded Knee in 1890, for example, the absolute murder, genocide of communities. Returning land doesn't seem to repair much of the genocidal acts. But it can be reparations for broken treaties and land that was improperly taken. Much of the land that was taken from Indian tribes was taken pursuant to promises in treaties. Land was ceded, and the tribes reserved other land, often where they were, although sometimes they moved to a different place. But the promises said things like, you will have your land that you're retaining, you're reserving, you will have that land as long as the river shall run and the grass shall grow. That sounds like forever. And that's what the natives thought they were getting. We all know that's not exactly what happened. Usually within a decade or two or three, more land was taken from them, and so those treaties were broken. That is really, but returning land can help repair some of those issues. There's also, a lot of people have other reasons for land back, and social justice is a big concept. But some of these claims are based on indigenous environmentalism. I think that there are people that think that tribes will be less focused on building pipelines and extracting resources and that sort of thing, and so would like to see land returned for environmentalist reasons. Certainly, a lot of the land that's been taken and a lot of the issues that come up here are around environmental justice, because often land that was taken from tribes is still very close to where tribal communities live, and the things done on those lands are harmful to the tribes. But we might call it social justice, restorative justice, environmental justice. They're all sort of related. Here's another one, conservation. A whole bunch of organizations about a year and a half ago pledged more than $100 million to support indigenous conservation. $100 million. And this is different than the $175 million that's gone to the Indian Collective. This is other money. And part of it is, these green groups, we call them green groups, these organizations that are really focused on environmentalism and conservation, and these, that are foundations that have resources, they've sometimes not been very trusting of tribes because their singular goal is conservation. But they've been allies occasionally with tribes, but lately they've been working much more with tribes. I think it's an interest convergence thing. They share some similar interests. And some of you have probably heard of the 30 by 30 pledge. The Biden administration has characterized it as the America the Beautiful initiative, but it's to conserve 30% of the United States by 2030. And conservation organizations kind of have done the math, and you can't get there without tribal support, because tribes do own nearly 60 million acres in the United States, and you got to have tribes cooperating, or you're never going to get to 30% of the land mass of the United States. So that's why this 30 by 30 has, these green organizations have really gotten to where they are supporting, supporting tribes and land back because of conservation. There are also some utilitarian justifications for land back. Tribes have special skills and expertise. Obviously, they stewarded this land for centuries before Columbus arrived and Europeans arrived and others. Anybody remember this famous thing by the famous anthropologist Franz Boas about Eskimos have more than 50 words for snow? Yeah. Well, if you got 50 different words for something, that represents a lot of nuance, and that's scientific knowledge. It's at least knowledge, and it's knowledge based on experience usually. It spawned a great debate. Is it true? There's been lots of debates, but there have been some other studies. Lots of people, anthropologists have studied, linguists have studied it over the years because people have been skeptical. But there was a recent study that found that Inupiat people have more than 100 words for sea ice because sea ice has so many variations and stuff. That's knowledge. It's not tested in the same way. We don't test it in a lab. I mean, Native people don't test this knowledge in a lab. Their lives depend on it. It's far more serious than lab testing and that kind of thing. They use it to govern their lives in hostile environments, and so I think we can trust it, and it can lead us to scientific advancement if we trust indigenous knowledge, or at least consider it in our other ways of knowing. So one of my claims here is that Landback is really a part of a spectrum of things that happen. And I will tell you, I've been a federal government employee a lot I've been a public servant. I've been either at the federal government or in public educational institutions my whole life, pretty much, one or the other. I'm sometimes defensive about the federal. People criticize the government all the time, and it's due for some criticism, especially in Indian policy. But one of the things that I've been, activists have been pushing really hard for Landback, and part of my effort is to show. I'll show you in a little while that Landback has been happening, but I also wanted to show that Landback is kind of part of a spectrum of activities that are all sort of restorative for tribes, and in a good way. So let me talk about some of those. So this is Denali. This was the mountain formerly known as Mount McKinley. It's the tallest peak in North America. And we got to go to Alaska whenever that was announced, the renaming of Denali in the Obama administration. And I'd been working in the Obama administration, and I had been hammering through really difficult policy changes, traveling all over the country, meeting with people and rewriting regulations and that sort of thing. And this was done with the stroke of a pen, and it was merely symbolic. It had no policy ramifications, and people were far more thrilled with this than anything I was doing, and I was doing real work, and I was kind of angry about it at the time. Are you kidding me? It's just a renaming, but it's interesting how this isn't a powerful symbol. Denali is an important symbol, and one of the things I've kind of come to realize, if you name something, you kind of own it, and so restoring the native name, the indigenous name for this peak, is really important at a deep level because I think it's a recognition by everybody that is indigenous space, and so it's not Landback. It's still run by the Park Service and the Forest Service and federal land management agencies, but it's moving in that direction, I think. There's other renamings are maybe not so much about Landback, but they're about respect. So this is Piestewa Peak in Arizona, in the Phoenix area. It was normal. It had its previous name started with S and was a rude name for Native American women, and it's been removed from more than 500 landmarks across the United States, and that's a good improvement too. In this case, it was replaced by the name of a Hopi woman who had fought in Iraq, and a soldier, a Hopi woman soldier, and that was a much better name than the old name. So that connotes respect and understanding a lot better. That happened earlier. That was Governor Janet Napolitano pushed for that and replaced it on the state side, and then the federal government adopted that as well soon thereafter. Conservation is an excellent example of things that are on the spectrum of Landback, but not exactly Landback. And so this is a map. The Grand Canyon is the squiggly thing in the middle. This is a national monument. These 3 parcels, totaling about 917,000 acres, constitute a national monument, encouraged by the Navajo Nation and several others. There's a native name that I'm not going to attempt to pronounce, but the Ancestral Footprints is the English name for this national monument. This was just done in August of 2023. So 900,000 acres, though, that have been removed from the public domain, so nobody can drill or mine on them, and they will be protected. So conservation is really important to tribes, and it's a place where tribes are making a difference. And conserving the land is not Landback, but it's close. Same with Bears Ears National Monument. There's been a lot of fighting over this one. This is this iconic feature in Utah, and those look like ears of the bear. That's why it's got its name. The Bears Ears National Monument was established during the Obama administration, and it was over 1 million acres. And during the Trump administration shrunk it, and so much that the Bears Ears were not in the Bears Ears National Monument any longer. And then the Biden administration came back in and restored it. And there's been a lot of litigation whether it's lawful to shrink a national monument, because the statute doesn't authorize decreasing national monuments. It authorizes creating them. It doesn't explicitly give the power to disestablish it or shrink it, diminish it. And there may still be more litigation if we get another administration. We'll see. Co-stewardship. When you share stewardship of land with tribes, when the federal government and tribes work together, that's also not land back, but it feels to me somewhere on that spectrum. And again, Bears Ears National Monument is another good example of that. In the executive order by President Obama and then reaffirmed by President Biden that establishes this national monument, a commission was established for 5 tribes that were involved in this, and they represent the commission to advise in a very formal way the management of this national monument. Again, not land back, but certainly respect and engagement and participation. So it might be somewhat in the same neighborhood. This one, I don't know. This one's in Iowa, actually. Effigy Mounds National Monument. It's on the bluffs of the Mississippi River, over by, Dubuque and Prairie du Chien, Wisconsin. I can't remember what's on the Minnesota side of that area, but they're all kind of in that area where they all 3 come together. Effigy Mounds National Monument is run by the Park Service, and these mounds are in the shape of animals, and they're ancient. They've been there for a very, very long time, bears and other animals. You can see those mounds. This is a federal facility, but it's got a sister park arrangement with the Iowa Tribes National Park in Oklahoma, and they exchange personnel and stuff like that. It's just a neat example of cooperation and co-stewardship of this federal facility and a tribal facility, tribal park in Oklahoma. Co-management. There's a lot of co-management that's happening around the country, and this also to me feels like on the spectrum towards land back. And there's a great example right here in Minnesota, and I don't know if anybody's ever gone this far. This is way out on the Arrowhead, north of Lake Superior, what they call it the Arrowhead of Minnesota, that little point out there before you get to Thunder Bay, Canada. The last little tip of Minnesota is a national park facility called Grand Portage National Monument, and it's been there for a very long time. And the Grand Portage Band of Chippewa Indians actually encouraged the founding of this park, this national monument, and they signed an agreement very early on to help run that national monument. So they get some resources from the National Park Service. And it only makes sense because only the Grand Portage Band and the National Park Service unit are out there. There's no one else out there really. And why do you need to buy 2 snowplows? If you can work together, you can buy 1 snowplow and share it, right? There's good reasons for sharing and co-management of a facility like this. And indeed, it was the Grand Portage Band that donated the land for this national monument. I mean, they wanted it to happen in part for economic development and tourism and that sort of thing. But that's been a really successful example. I've criticized it a little bit in some of my writing because there's no reason why they ought not be running the whole thing, but they only have part of the contract to run part of it. We probably could, contract with them to run the entire national monument. There's myriad other examples of co-management. There are a bunch of fish commissions around the country. These were spawned in large measure from litigation in the 1970s in Minnesota and Wisconsin and Michigan around spearfishing and other types of fishing that native rights were reestablished to exercise fishing rights, and the tribes came together to create federally authorized fishing commissions. This one was a picture from the Columbia River in the Pacific Northwest, but there's a Great Lakes Intertribal Fishing Commission, and there's also another one in the Northwest besides this one on different rivers and waterways. Retrocession of criminal jurisdiction is happening quite a bit, and this is the term we use whenever state jurisdiction that has been authorized by Congress, which was not the original state of affairs, but Congress authorized some state jurisdiction, and then it's been taken away, and returned to the tribes and the federal government. We call that retrocession. And in Iowa, this is where I'm from. That's not where I live. That's the Meskwaki Reservation. But the row of counties, we have 99 counties in Iowa. Trivia fact. I live one down and three over, the one that has a little boot hill sticking down or something like that. That's the one, that's where I live, Johnson County. But this is the Meskwaki settlement that's circled. And in 2019, Congress enacted, at the request of Senator Grassley and Senator Ernst, the Iowa senators, Republicans, by the way, and an entirely Republican congressional delegation, by the way, signed legislation rescinding legal authority by the state over the Meskwaki Reservation. So returning it to tribal authority and federal authority. It's only about 8,000 acres. It's not a large reservation. And in fact, they get mad if you call it a reservation because they were removed to Oklahoma and then they bought the land back and they called it the Meskwaki Settlement. And they don't like the connotation of reservation. It's negative to them, so they like to call it the Meskwaki Settlement, but they've got full authority restored over their land, and it was signed by Donald Trump. And I'm not I'm not here to sell you on Donald Trump by any means, but it's interesting that even Donald Trump, is doing things that are on the spectrum towards Landback. I think that's how maybe uncontroversial in some ways it is, that there, and everybody recognizes there's been injustice, and even the Trump administration is on board with at least some of this stuff. Here's another example. This was during the Obama administration, but the guy in the regular jacket, the white guy in the regular jacket in the back, is Governor Jay Inslee of Washington State, and he agreed to retrocede land for the Yakima Nation back to the tribe and the federal government. That's their council table, and that's the council in full regalia on the day that was signed. I've been there. When they invite federal officials, that council table is shaped like an arrowhead, and they make the federal officials stand at the point of the arrow. It's quite intimidating. But I got to sign that one too, and so that one had to be approved by the federal government, and I got to be the one to make that important decision. And so that was a big deal, returning that power. And so previous one need to be done by Congress, the Meskwaki one. This one could be done by the executive branch with cooperation with the state. And there's even been judicial retrocession, I would argue. Some of you have probably heard about the McGirt decision. The first line of the McGirt decision is this: at the end of the Trail of Tears was a promise. And the judge, Justice Neil Gorsuch, a very conservative Republican, but who really cares about Native American issues, issued this decision basically saying, you know, a treaty is a promise, and we're going to meet the terms of that promise until we're told otherwise by Congress. And he went through the history, and he said Congress has never abrogated this treaty that says that the Muskogee Creek Reservation in Oklahoma is a reservation. It had been treated like it was no longer a reservation anymore for 100 years. But he said, you know, no more. We're not gonna treat it that way because it's never been abrogated. So that decision led to several other cases reestablishing that Oklahoma has numerous reservations within it, including my own, by the way. I grew up saying that I grew up within my tribe's former reservation boundaries, and after 2020, I got to say I grew up within my tribe's reservation. And I was 53 years old before I got to say that, and it was quite meaningful. A lot of people, when they read the first line of that decision, you could tell where it was going, and lots of people, I got a lump in my throat when I read that decision. It was during the pandemic. I was sitting in my basement, you know, online, and I read that opinion, and I just, you know, wanted to shout. Reservation restoration is really what that was. He said that this reservation still exists. But the Supreme Court's been doing that. There's another case from not too far from here called Nebraska v. Parker, and that was another Supreme Court victory. In that case, Justice Clarence Thomas held that the reservation had not been disestablished. It still existed for the Omaha Reservation in Nebraska, in kind of northeast Nebraska, not too far from here. Clarence Thomas, very conservative justice, but you know, basically, it was another situation where people had acted as though the reservation no longer existed. And now let me get even closer to home, because I drove right by here on the way out to get out here, and this is the Shakopee, Mdewakanton, Dakota community. Their efforts, they have been repurchasing their land. They've been using their gaming revenues to reacquire lands and then take them to the federal government and ask the federal government to take those lands into trust. The reason they do that is because that takes the land off of the state tax rolls and prevents the state from taxing those lands or, God forbid, taking the land for tax sale if they don't pay their taxes. If it's in the states cannot tax the federal government, so when it's held in trust by the federal government, you know, that's how you get true tribal sovereignty back, because the federal government protects that. But they have been reacquiring lands, 100 acres here, 150 acres there, 5 acres, and I mean, they've been doing this for years. And they've once that land is taken into trust, the person in the Assistant Secretary for Indian Affairs in Washington can declare it a reservation, can restore it to reservation status by just issuing a declaration. And they have restored 1,700 acres to create a reservation. You know, they're a fairly recently re-recognized tribe, I believe in the early 1980s. And they're in the Minneapolis suburbs. Land is expensive there. It's expensive real estate, but they've been reacquiring and rebuilding their land. And the Trump administration, by the way, continued even during that period. It's, you know, again, not controversial. I mean, it might be controversial to Canterbury Park or some of the other people in the community, but it's happening. So, talking a little bit about Landback, a big point of history where things really started to change was in 1934, the Indian New Deal, when FDR was elected and came in, and Secretary Harold Ickes was the cabinet secretary. That's the gentleman seated there, and John Collier ran Indian Affairs in that time, and that's a group of native delegates from the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribe in western Montana that were meeting with them that day, but they passed a new law called the Indian Reorganization Act. It's got a really boring title, but one of the things that it did, it said that we have failed Native Americans. It was after the allotment period where a lot of the reservations had been split into parcels and land had been given to individual families and then opened up for settlement of the surplus lands. And tribes lost 90 million acres over the space of about 40 years. 90 million acres. It was there was a period in the 1850s when numerous treaties were signed. In a 3-year period, they lost something like 150 million acres. So they've lost. There's been these periods where they've lost massive amounts of land. And in 1934, the Roosevelt administration was in. They'd been elected in 32 and came in 33 and started doing things. And they passed this statute in 1934 called the Indian Reorganization Act. And one of the things it did was it stopped the allotment of native lands, and it said that we can take land into trusts for tribes. We can take land back for tribes. And it authorized, I think it was $1 million a year or something like that in appropriations to purchase lands back. It was, it was a lot of land was, the cows were out of the barn by that point, but it was a good move. It was a positive move. So, one of the things, and this is kind of for the activists that don't recognize that this has happened very much. There's a whole bunch of examples of land back that are actually routine government actions. And so what I'm going to do now is talk about some of those and explain numerous different kinds of routine policy of the federal government that is focused on land back. We've been doing this since 1934 on a fairly regular basis. That's 90 years, and we've been taking land back in many different ways since that time. And I got to show you another Republican. I've been an appointee in the Clinton administration, the Obama administration, and I ran the transition for the Department of the Interior for the Biden administration, and my wife worked in the Biden White House. And I'm talking about Republicans, but the point here is that even the Republicans haven't been bad on this issue. This is Richard Nixon. That's the East Room of the White House, returning Blue Lake to the Taos Pueblo. Blue Lake was Forest Service land, and in 1970, the tribes they'd been advocating for this, but Richard Nixon said, it's the right thing to do. We're going to sign Blue Lake back over to the Taos Pueblo. It's very important to them. I can't tell you why, because that's secret to them, and it's not my job to know what that is. But he returned numerous acres. It was tens of thousands of acres, I believe, to Taos Pueblo. And it was a big deal. He got really good press for that. He didn't get good press in the New York Times generally from day one. He got great press from that, and someone that was there at the time said they got a call from the White House basically saying, do you have any more Blue Lakes? Because we got good press and would have loved to get more. So those are some examples. But this Blue Lake, return of Blue Lake in 1970, really kicked off a new era of land back for Indian tribes. And the Nixon administration, Tricky Dick deserves a lot of credit for a lot of bad things, but he went to China and he did some good things in Indian country for tribes, and this was one of the big ones. A more recent example, and this is sort of the bookend, because another example of these big actions where you go to Congress and get them to pass something and the president signs it, is the National Bison Range in western Montana. The National Bison Range was run by the Fish and Wildlife Service. It's about 18,000 acres, if my recollection is correct. The tribe started agitating for co-management of the National Bison Range in the early 2000s, and they actually got a co-management agreement, and they ran it for a little while, and everybody started bickering. Some local ranchers and even some tribal people were mad about it, and so it kind of all fell apart. So the opponents, won the battle, but then they lost the war because Congress said, you know what, if you guys can't get along, we're just going to return it to the tribe. And that was the right thing to do, because the Fish and Wildlife Service primary mission is around endangered species, and bison don't exist in nearly the numbers that they used to exist in, but they aren't endangered anymore. They're not even threatened, and so it was not a high-value property. It was a neat property, but it was not a high-value property for the mission of the Fish and Wildlife Service. So during the Obama administration, they started talking about doing this, and one of the dynamics you see in Congress, we saw it with the immigration bill. You know, the Biden administration was willing to get a bill passed and trying to get a bill passed that would really toughen things at the border. And the Republicans said, we'd rather not have that bill passed. We'd rather run on the issue. And so they blocked the bill. The bill that, by the way, wasn't very much beloved by progressives. I mean, you know, people were mad about Biden for even considering this. But the Republican administration said, the Republican Congress, members of Congress in the House said, we don't want to pass it because we'd rather have the issue that we can, you know, beat the Biden administration over the head with. And some of these Landback proposals are similar to that in that this didn't happen during the Obama administration because I think no one wanted to give the Obama administration a victory, but all the work had been done, and soon as Trump was in office, it's like, let's give Trump a victory, and let him, and he signed it. To his credit, he signed it, but some of this stuff is pure politics, and you know, Trump wanted to be a hero. He wants to be a hero to tribes, and so he, you know, this happened, and he signed it. So here's why the federal government is a good place to look if you want to do land back. Those little blocks are treaty cessions to the federal government from tribes. And there are about 718 different records that created this document. Mostly treaties, but some executive orders too. And much of this land, I mean, the natives on the far east coast their land was taken long before the United States ever existed, and a lot of them were, you know, you've probably heard or read a lot of them were lost to disease, and some to warfare and such, but a lot of them to disease. Remember, Europe was dealing with the Black Plague not long before, you know, contact with with North America, and so a lot of the natives just died, and if you do the reading, a lot of the European settlers thought this was God. God created these laser level fields that are free of rocks and stuff, and he must have created them for us. Well, the tribes, native people worked really hard to get those fields cleared so they could, plant on them and that sort of thing. And then they died they were just devastated by European diseases. So when the Europeans settlers arrived and they found these perfect fields to plant, it was, they thought it was, divine intervention, delivery by God. But the rest of the country was pretty much given up by tribes in treaties, formal negotiations and over time treaty grants. And so this is why, we look to the federal government. One of the problems with all, general real estate in the United States when you think about land back is, a lot of, even land that was stolen from tribes, there's several generations removed from that happening. And, every baby is born innocent, right? I mean, new generations shouldn't necessarily pay for the sins of the past generations because they are not responsible for that, creating that wrong. And in some ways, the reliance interest, there's real philosophical questions about whether you can take land from innocent people to restore to tribes. The federal government doesn't have that defense, though. It's the same Uncle Sam is the same guy now as he was during this entire history, right? It's the same entity, so it's not a different person or a different entity. It's the exact same entity. It's the United States. And so one of the things you can see from this map, you can see that's all native land, or at least within reservations, not all owned by tribes, but on the far right side. And this on the left is federal lands that are managed by the federal government. And you can actually see in some places the purple over there will fit in over here like a puzzle piece. So if you look at the New Mexico and Arizona there, in the Four Corners region, you see the big blob over there that's the Navajo Nation. It'll plop right into this map right here. In other words, if it was on this map, it would be surrounded by federal land anyway, right? And so it's all adjacent. And you can see it in other places too. You can see right up there in the middle of Wyoming, you see the Wind River Reservation over on this map, and then you see the big hole in the middle of Wyoming from the purple. And so again, a lot of this native land is surrounded by federal land. And so it makes great sense to look at federal land. All of this land, most of the federal land in the United States, and many of the reservations are sort of west of the 100th meridian, Wallace Stegner's famous 100th meridian, which runs kind of through the middle of the Dakotas and Nebraska, and it's everything west of there. Down through the panhandle of Oklahoma, it's kind of where the purple really starts becoming more ubiquitous after that. So it's a lot, it's hard to unscramble the egg for private land that's been in private hands for multi-generations, but this land has been in the federal government's hands throughout. So it's a good place to look. Here's another map of federal lands from the U.S. Geological Survey, and this shows there's numerous different kinds of federal lands there's the Forest Service, there's the Bureau of Land Management, Fish and Wildlife Service, National Park Service, and Bureau of Reclamation, and a few others. But it's all over the West, and this one shows in beige the native lands, the native reservations. So there you see it clearly how they're surrounded by federal lands. So there's it's a target-rich environment when you're looking at federal lands and thinking about land back for tribes. A lot of that land is pretty barren land. There's not a lot of communities living there, and it's was lived on and stewarded by Indian tribes for centuries and centuries and centuries before non-Indians arrived on this continent. Taking land into trust. This is that process that I talked about a little bit, like Shakopee, like a tribe reacquires land and then the federal government takes it into trust. The Obama administration did 562,000 acres over the course of 8 years of the Obama administration. The Trump administration did 75,000 acres. Even they need to do this, right? They've got reasons to do it as well. One of the reasons for that, by the way, is that there are 34 states that have Indian reservations in them. Not all of those are blue states. Some of them are red states, right? Some of them are like Iowa with 2 Republican senators. But if you've got land in 34 states, you've got reservations in 34 states, how many senators do you have? You got more than 2/3 of the senators, right? And they're not in every congressional district, but they're in a large number of congressional districts too. And so it's, Republican senators and Republican members of Congress want to please their constituents when they can do so without too much disruption of others, generally. And so they even have been allies in many respects in doing this sort of thing. Here's another way that land gets returned to Indian tribes, the base realignment and closure process, the BRAC process. We haven't heard so much about it in recent years, but when we were shrinking the military, starting about 30 years ago somewhat, and mothballing old bases, it was a highly political thing. It was really unpopular. No congressman, no senator wants their base in their district shut down. So they created this very formalistic process, the base realignment and closure process. But the rules of the BRAC, this process, provide that land that was taken from the public domain to make a military base can be returned to the public domain and or Indian tribes. And so Indian tribes sort of get first dibs on lands that they ceded, that they once owned through this process. Not great land. The Badger Army Munition Plant over in Wisconsin, for example, it was closed, and so the Ho-Chunk tribe over in in Wisconsin said, we want it back. Well, it's, most of these are Superfund sites. They are highly polluted lands. They have munitions, that sometimes they were, testing ranges and things like that for bombs and missiles. And so cleaning them up is kind of hard. And so there's always, fights about who's going to bear the liability if someone, creates sets off a bomb and people die and stuff. So there's a lot of cleanup that has to happen. But the Badger Army Ammunition Plant was returned to the Ho-Chunk Nation, at least part of it was. And Fort Wingate, that's over in western New Mexico near the Arizona border. And it was a similar thing. It was a place they used to shoot off missiles towards the White Sand Missile Range over in New Mexico from Fort Wingate. But that fort has been there since the Navajo Nation was sent on the long walk to Bosque Redondo, and from the 1860s. So it's been there a long time, but it was shuttered, and 20,000 acres of the Fort Wingate military base was returned to the Navajo Nation and the Zuni tribes, which it was adjacent to both of those reservations. Let me offer one other example. So during the allotment era, lands in all these green states were allotted to Indian tribes, individual Indians, and after the allotment happened, the leftover lands were opened up to settlement. But what happened was, in 1934, they realized this allotment process was an absolute disaster because tribes had lost 90 million acres, and they were losing more of it because as soon as it got allotted to the natives, pretty soon they would be subject to sale or property taxes, state taxes, and they would lose their land to tax sales. And if they kept the land, in 1934, what the Congress said is that all that land's going to be held in trust for individuals, so that doesn't keep happening. But then what happened was people would die without wills, Native Americans with these parcels, and before long, you ended up, the head of household would get a 160-acre parcel, and they would die, and it would be left to their 10 kids, or 8 kids, or 6 kids, or 11 kids. My mom was one of 11 children and grew up in Oklahoma, in the Chickasaw Nation, and so that suddenly you have this parcel that's owned by 11 different people, and they each have children, and so we ended up having parcels that had more than 1,000 owners, and so during this, there was a litigation, Cobell versus the United States, that sued the United States for not keeping good records of the income owed from these parcels to Native Americans, and they won the case in essence. But the United States, to settle the case, agreed to spend $1.9 billion to solve this problem by buying fractional interests in land. And this slide is from partway through the process. Ultimately, the Cobell land buyback program returned 2.964, almost 3 million acres to tribes in various fractional interests, but it adds up to almost 3 million acres. And so a lot of land was returned during the Obama administration. It took 10 years, and through the Trump administration, through that program. So land back of nearly 3 million acres. There's also starting to be a bunch of other examples around the country where green organizations and land trusts, land conservancies are starting to give land back to tribes. One recent one, back in November, the Trust for Public Land announced that it was transferring 30,000 acres of land to the Penobscot Nation in Maine, near the Katahdin Woods and Waters National Monument, back to the tribe. 30,000 acres. And Professor, I've been giving this talk around the country, and every time I do, I hear about another example. Professor Knudsen today said on February 16th, she told me about this state park here in Minnesota that was returned to the Lower Sioux community recently. I had no idea. The Upper Sioux community, 1,200-acre park, which was formerly the Upper Sioux Agency State Park, and it had been a state park since 1963. 1,200 acres right here in Minnesota returned to the Upper Sioux community. So it's happening. It's really starting to catch on. And there was another recent one in California, some coastal land that was returned, and a co-management agreement was signed. And it's happening so often that I'm having a hard time keeping up. This is going to turn into an empirical work rather than sort of the anecdotal stuff that I'm doing now soon, because it's happening so often in so many places around the country, and so that's a real victory for land back. All right. Here's where I think we need to do more thinking, and maybe in the next place where we ought to think about doing land back, and it's along the rivers. And one example of where this has been really bad, a real problem, is along the Missouri River, which is also, which is not far. Cuts through North Dakota and South Dakota, and then runs the Missouri River, you'll recall, is the western boundary of Iowa. We call it the West Coast. But the west coast of Iowa is the Missouri River. And one of the things that happened on the Missouri River is the Army Corps of Engineers in the 1950s built a series of dams for navigation and water storage. And conveniently, every one of those dams was built at a place where the primary community that would be flooded out because of the dam was a Native American reservation. And they weren't given fair value for that land. And furthermore, they've promised that we're going to take this land from you, but any that we turned out we didn't need, we're going to return to you. Well, they never returned. They didn't return the land, the excess land that they didn't need. They took it, but they never returned it. And it was a lot. It was, for one example, Lake Oahe. On the right side, it looks like a river, but it's a lake because they dammed up a river to make a lake. And that one flooded. It was 200 miles of shoreline and more than 200,000 acres on the Standing Rock Sioux Reservation. 200,000 acres is a lot of acres. They did the same thing. This is the Garrison Dam, creating Lake Sacagawea on the Fort Berthold Indian Reservation in North Dakota. You can see that it flooded the very center of it used to be just a river running through there. Now it's a huge lake. That was more than, I think that was 250,000 acres or something like that. I don't have it in my notes, but you can see that it's a lot of land and a big chunk of the reservation gone. And my sense is the moral claims for return of that land are particularly strong, and a good case can be made that would be somewhat compelling, return of land around those lakes. So that's kind of where I want to go next with this project. But that's it. We've been doing land back. I won't say it's been easy or it's been fast. Some of those BRAC processes, base realignment and closure, some of those took 15 years to happen. So it's not quick, but we've been doing it very steadily now for some land back at least for 90 years. And since 1970, we've been doing a fair bit of it, and we've especially been moving forward aggressively in the last 5 years. And it's actually a relatively positive story. We've not taken back anywhere near the 90 million acres that was lost during the allotment era or the 153 million acres that was lost in the 1850s, but we have been gradually getting meaningful land back for Indian tribes, and we do need to do a heck of a lot more. But I think, most people haven't noticed this, so it hasn't been too disruptive. It's an easy thing to do. It's not as hard as it seems. It may be hard in individual communities, but over time it's meaningful for tribes. And I hope I've convinced you that it's possible, and we can do it, and we can do more of it. So that's the claim. I will stop there, and I'll take questions. Thank you. All right, and we've got a mic down here, so. The red button.
Testing. Oh, it's working. Our tradition is for Catherine Christensen to get to ask the first question if she would like to. And
Thank you so much. All right, is this working? Can you hear me in the back?
All right, thank you. Thank you. A little closer. And
There you go.
there we go. All right. Thank you so much, Dean Washburn, for being with us. I think what we've heard today reminds us that history is stories. And I think all of us in this room have learned, the American story, the westward, pushing westward. We've learned it, different generations represented here. We've learned in different times in different ways. So I really want to thank you for renewing the story and, bringing us up to date with things like retrocession, renaming. We've heard about renaming here in Minnesota. Co-management, environmental justice, very important, and co-stewardship. I think we needed the reminder that you gave us that for centuries, this land was stewarded well by the native people. And then we came in, and we, the Europeans. And I would find hope in what you said about the that knowledge, that tradition that has been handed down can help us now and in the future with what we face environmentally. So I just and I want to thank everyone for coming to hear this. Wasn't this a great talk?
I do
Thank
too.
you. Thank you.
Hello. Do I have to say my name? No. Okay. So, Gustavus used to be Native American land. However, we ended up building a school here. So my question is, in what ways can we show respect or acknowledgement to these groups?
Thank you for the question, and don't feel guilty because it was all native land, right? I mean, it's all of North America. You're not special. You're not any worse than anybody else. I think a lot of this, and perhaps I should have started with a land acknowledgement. I didn't. I kind of feel like it's assumed whenever I'm speaking about this stuff. But it really is important, to acknowledge it, because that's been a real victory in recent years, is that people now know, right? I mean, I think that, a lot of us growing up didn't learn about Indian tribes in public education or, in our schools. We learned that there's the United States and there's states. And we never learned that there's this third sovereign that's actually really active and has been here longer than those other two and has been governing longer than those other two. And so I think, realizing that this is native land, I had a bumper sticker when I was in college, and it said Indian country in red letters, and it showed all of North and South America. It was the whole Western Hemisphere. And some people say, well, how much Landback do you want? And I was like, yeah, eventually all of it. But don't get nervous. It's not going to happen, soon. But I think, knowing it and acknowledging it is really, really important. And I think, we need to do that. Thanks for the question.
Oh, of course you're on that side. Yeah, I'm getting there. It's all right.
Rich.
Hi, I'm very, very pleased to be here and want to thank you for this wonderful presentation. I have a question about the Landback and Landback situation and how services might be rendered. Thinking of fire and police and the court system, especially with MMIW and MMIR people. I know there's a real controversy with that, and I wish you could speak to something of that.
Yeah, I'd be delighted to. So the MMI, missing and murdered Indigenous women and Indigenous persons issue, really, the interesting outcome of that is Congress passing 2 laws, Violence Against Women Act reauthorizations, that restored criminal justice authority to Indian tribes because the people that were responsible for prosecuting those kinds of cases were not doing so. And so interestingly, Congress said if the feds aren't going to prosecute adequately or states aren't going to prosecute adequately, we're going to restore tribal criminal jurisdiction over non-Indians that are committing crimes. And so even Congress has sort of said, look, we need tribal governance back. We need to bring it back because we're not doing the job in Indian country, and that's why, you know, Native women and people are going missing. And so restoring, you know, the tribal governments are the ones closer to their communities than their land. They can govern it better than states and counties are relatively close and local communities, but the tribes are, you know, they've been there for in many cases for centuries, and they are capable of doing this kind of work. And so Congress has been, you know, even recognizing that. So that will help. Over time, it will take a while to get that machinery back, those muscles reformed for tribes, but that will help. Thank you.
Hello. So you kind of touched on it during your speech, but you mentioned some of the more like innocent actors in the Landback movement, like people who weren't directly obviously involved in like taking indigenous land. So I'm just wondering your perspective on how we kind of balance, you know, remedying like this massive harm to indigenous communities while also kind of protecting more innocent actors.
Yeah. Well, that's the hardest question in some respects, and that's why I sidestepped it. Because the federal government's easy to go after, right? It's, I mean, look at that. Look at, you know, and it doesn't have to, you know, I can avoid raising all those really difficult moral questions about, you know, innocent actors if I focus on the federal government. So we all have to live together, you know, and I'm a beneficiary of this wonderful country, I mean, to be quite honest. And so I've got mixed feelings about this. And tribal leaders have mixed feelings about it too. Even tribal leaders that will say, we want our land back. One of my friends, one of my mentors used to say, you know what, if tribal leaders got their way and all the Europeans went back to Ellis Island and got on boats and went back to Europe, he'd say, come back here, you're running out on your responsibilities. That's what the Indians would say. And it's like, we've gotten, you know, it's again, hard to unscramble the egg that we've created here. And so I'm focusing on the easier, not that this is easy, but it's easier than, you know, taking people's land. That's never going to happen in my world or my lifetime. And I'm not sure it's the right thing to happen. So thanks for the question.
I was just wondering about the lifestyle switch that would happen if the national parks were returned to indigenous people. Because of colonization, a lot of the culture has kind of shifted, like, for example, the way that natives dress and things like that, or have been influenced by European colonization. Mm-hmm. And so if the natives were to go back to, for example, in large numbers back to the national parks, wouldn't that be difficult for many of them to adjust to being in that type of environment if they've been in the city or on a reservation for an extended amount of time? I know a lot of reservations are kind of far away from like the nearest grocery store, so to speak. Mm-hmm. So there is a difference in culture and lifestyle in a reservation as opposed to like living in the city. But then at the same time, if groups of natives were to move or maybe dwell upon the land of the national parks, how would they kind of go back to that? Or how would we shift from difference in lifestyle after colonization back to native lifestyle, which mm-hmm. I would assume that would kind of go back alongside the Landback concept is also a culture back type mm-hmm. of thing too. Mm-hmm. But yeah, I don't know. What would that look like?
You know, so when I was the Assistant Secretary for Indian Affairs in the Obama administration, that position oversees the Bureau of Indian Affairs and the Bureau of Indian Education, the BIA and the BIE. And the director of the BIA who reported to me, he was a career official. He was the highest career official, and he reported to me. I was a political official. And he used to take the summer, and he's from Montana, he would take his Harley Davidson and he'd ride with he's a buddy that they'd go ride their Harley Davidsons through the interior West. And he stopped at a Park Service facility, a park, one time, and there were non-Indians dressed fully in Indian garb doing interpretation, explaining the native significance of this park. And he called me and he said, "You got to go talk to the director of the National Park Service. This is not right." It's like, in this day and age, you can't have non-Indian white people dressing up like Indians to explain what this park means to Indians and such. And that was pretty compelling. And that, I thought, yeah, that's low-hanging fruit. We got to get that stopped. And so I don't actually, even if David Troyer's pretty outlandish, assertion that we should return all the national parks to Indian tribes, if that were done, I'm not sure you'd see a whole lot of difference than what you see now. Probably some sacred areas would be placed off limits and stuff. But tribes and tribal governments are, their stewardship would probably also involve tourism and letting other people enjoy the parks, right? They would make different choices than your average conservationist might make. At the margins, there would be different choices. But I'm not sure it would be dramatically different than what's happening now. And I'm not sure they would wholesale. Native people don't want to move either. I'll tell you, the reason we have so many Native American people in cities is because in the 1950s, the Bureau of Indian Affairs had this program called the Urban Relocation Program. And the program was a bus ticket. That was basically the program. We'll give you a bus ticket to Minneapolis or Denver or Portland or Los Angeles or New York or Chicago. And that was basically it. There was not a robust program. It was a bus ticket. And the result was, and it might have been $150 for the first month to live on till you get your feet under you and figure out how to live in this new urban environment that's utterly foreign. But it resulted in a lot of homeless Native Americans all over in major cities, all over the country. And so, my sense that we've not been very good about when we ask people to relocate. So I would not ask people to relocate. But returning the national parks to tribes, again, I don't think that's a realistic proposal. But if it were to happen, I think it would be an economic development and tourism. And, I'm not sure it would be very different than the way the parks are run now.
What would you think about like a transitional type of program, maybe for Native women to focus on intergenerational trauma healing that's specifically meant for them, that's kind of out of the way, like in a natural environment, and then kind of gradually they just see kind of what they want to do, if they want to go back to maybe a former lifestyle from way back in the day or something like that, or I don't know.
And I think a lot of that kind of stuff, I think tribes are really, one thing they're trying to do is preserve their native languages, because we are losing native languages as elders die, and we've been seen this real revitalization of native languages. My own tribe, we have a Duolingo app on our phone. We can learn it through the same way people learn European languages now on our phones. And we've really been working to revitalize that, and cultural revitalization is happening too. Trying to restore the old ways, and they won't be identical to the old ways because, different. We're all affected by the environment around us, but a lot of that kind of stuff is happening, and it's definitely in the trauma space. It's definitely making a difference. So yeah, it's good. It's a good question, good point.
Hi, thanks so much for your talk. It's super interesting, and it does get you thinking differently about Landback and reparations. I'm going to do that thing where I ask you something that you didn't talk about, so you may not have the answer to it. But this has been very, poli-sci top down, but following up on the question about the missing and murdered Indigenous women and what Native communities and tribes are demanding. And it's, Richard Nixon just didn't wake up one day and say, I'm going to sign this, or Trump, could you just give a little bit of a thumbnail sketch of what the activism and pressure by Native organizations and their allies looks like that gives us these kinds of things in terms of the combination of legal advocacy, grassroots advocacy, and then place that Landback activist struggle now in the context, sort of the other side of the spectrum, that this is also a spectrum of activism, not just a spectrum of federal action.
That's completely fair. And let me just say, yeah, Richard Nixon did not, I mean, that had been advocated for. The tribes had taken, Native people had taken over the Bureau of Indian Affairs building in Washington, D.C. for several days. Native Americans had taken over Alcatraz. You remember that? I mean, somebody remembers that. I mean, that activism really does support all this stuff. And that's why, all those pictures of Indian Collective and the activism and, no Dakota Access Pipeline, getting the activists engaged and marching on Washington and marching on the Supreme Court, that makes a difference. The world hears that, right? And that activism it does drive a lot of action. And, one of the things that we have to realize too, even the Violence Against Women Act reauthorization, it's not tribal leaders that are saying, give us more criminal justice authority. They're not saying, we want to throw our people in jail, our voters in jail, right? They're saying, we need to get this problem solved. And they would just as soon yell at the federal government. If you're a tribal leader and you're running for office, it's easier to point your finger at the federal government or at the state government and say, you need to do law enforcement. But what Native women activists did was they went to Congress and they said, we need to give tribal leaders this authority. And they didn't necessarily want it, honestly, because that puts them in the line of fire politically. And so that it's a really good point. The activists have a hugely important role to play here to drive this whole discussion. And yeah, you're right. This is kind of political science. I do political science without the sciencey part. Thank you. Great question. Let me just say thank you for all of you for being here tonight, and this is really fun for me. I'm a bureaucrat mostly. I'm an administrator, and I'm trying to nurse along my scholarly activity, and so thank you for suffering through it with me. I appreciate you.
Let's thank Professor Washburn again.